I'm Bob. I'm an alcoholic. Sober through the grace of God in AA since the 10th of December, 1967. For that, I am very grateful. The longest and the shortest sobriety were Minnesota guys. Kevin was in our, how many years? 20 years in our community. And he's just about to launch himself into another help program, and we think that's a great opportunity, and we hope that next year you will be here with a year and 2 days. I want to thank April and Dylan for the great hotel, for all the work you've done. 2 weeks after having that wonderful child that you have, the Francesca, that's really something. It's like looking at God. I mean, it is just really spectacular. And this is a nice conference. It's different. We do the Woodstocks and so many things, and you get something different. I think when you do the chapters, everybody's done a great job. Kelly was kind of a ringer. I don't know, they kind of put her up like she was actually going to do a chapter, and then she just kind of blew us out of the water. It was really kind of spectacular. I think it was kind of cheating, but pretty powerful cheating is what it was. And the rest of it is you get something different. I love all the presenters, and you get something different from people when we're doing this kind of stuff than you do when they're giving a talk. And that's one of the things I like the best about it. I've heard tapers talk a little bit about how they sell twice as many tapes at an event like this than they do when people are just giving their AA talk. So there must be that receptivity. I'm going to wander around for 10 or 15 minutes. I've got enough time left that I will get back on subject. I'm going to start on subject, but it just is going to be a little bit different than going into the spiritual awakening, which I will get to when I do it. When I was looking at Francesca the other day, as I say, it's like looking at God. There's a sense of awe. There are very few places in life where we allow ourselves a sense of awe. We just don't. Our mind goes, "Oh, I know that. I've seen that bird. I've seen that mountain. I've seen that ocean," and we get so mind-bound that we just no longer can kind of be in front of something without labeling it, without reducing it to a concept, to an idea, to a memory. And I want to talk a few minutes on just how wonderful our lives are and how wonderful we are, and how we talk about that we're kind of sitting in our seats, and the fact is we're on a spaceship going 1,000 miles every day, 1,000 miles an hour. And we're going 45,000 miles an hour around the sun. So we're going 1,000 miles an hour this way and 45,000 miles an hour that way. And 500,000 miles an hour in the arm of the Milky Way as it revolves around the center of the Milky Way. And 165,000 miles an hour as the universe expands. And we think we're sitting in our seat. It is. But there's a sense, there's a sense that when you get into some of these numbers and some of these ideas that there's a bigness in it that, puts us into a little bit of a sense of awe. The universe was born 13.8 billion years ago. Our solar system was born 4.5 billion years ago. Our solar system. Do you know what the most populous element in the universe is? Hydrogen. Do you know what percent of all the atoms in the universe hydrogen is? 75%. Do you know what the second most populous element is? Helium. You know what its percent is? A little over 24%. So every other element, other than hydrogen and helium, are rounding errors. They're nothing. I mean, they don't amount to anything. Well, how the hell did we get here? We're not just made of hydrogen and helium. Well, 4.5 billion years ago, so stars are the atomic furnaces. They make all the elements. So the first 5 elements were made in the Big Bang, and then the elements from about 5 to about 26 are made in stars, in the fusion experience of the stars. But when stars get to making iron, they start to die. And when they die, they implode, if they're big enough. And when they implode, they become a supernova. And in that explosion of the supernova is every other element in the universe. And that's us, along with the first, 10 or 15 that are in our body. There's, the rest of them are that. So we are the things of stardust. We would not be here. So we got here out of a supernova explosion 4.5 billion years ago. And everything in our solar system, kind of blew out in this area, and 90% of it ended up being in the sun, and the other 10% is distributed among the 8 or 9 planets, depending upon whether we think Pluto's not a planet. But we now think there's something bigger than Neptune out there. We just don't know exactly where it is. There are a couple of 100 billion stars in the Milky Way. And the Milky Way is one of a couple of 100 galaxies. So space is just, bigger and more complex and different than we could ever imagine that it is. So with all this scientific information we have about our universe, we only know what 4.5% of the universe is made of, which that blows my mind. We never had this conversation until I think the last dozen years. 72% of everything in the universe is dark energy, and 23% is dark matter, and 4.5% is stuff. Only 4.5% are those atoms of hydrogen and helium. That's all we know about, 4.5%. And we're trying to find out what the hell the rest of it is, but we really don't know. I'll come back to the Big Bang. In our body, each of our bodies, Dylan's a little bit more than my body. Sorry for the cheap shot. It's just you were in the seat. 40 to 70 trillion cells are in your body. Some of them are 3 feet long. Most of them are microscopic, smaller than anything we could see without a. Each cell in your body has 100 million atoms. The complexity of your body. Every cell in your body, with the exception of some cells in your cerebral cortex, in women's eggs and one other type of cell, and I can't remember, are replaced every 7 years. Every red blood cell in your body is replaced in 4 months. While I've been shooting my mouth off, 500 million red blood cells have been created in your body. So when we talk about being on top of the food chain, when we talk about being evolved, when we talk about the complexity and the wonder of anything, there's nothing that comes anywhere near, and we're focused on how much money we have in the bank, what kind of car we drive, what kind of house we live. I mean, we are the embodiment of the evolution, of the spear point of the evolving universe. It doesn't get any better than what we have been granted by just life. It is extraordinary. My sponsor died 2 months ago, His name was Howard Polens. He was my third sponsor. I had my first sponsor for 43 years. Then I hired Dick Martin. I signed Martin to a 10-year contract, and he crapped out on me at 5. He was a wonderful man, and we had a great relationship. And Howard, and I had a great relationship. I'd done my last 2 fifth steps with Howard, and I asked him to be my sponsor. And then just recently, 2 weeks ago, I asked a guy by the name of Tim Highland to be my sponsor from Louisville. And Howard had a scientific mind. He loved science. And one of the things, so Howard and I sometimes get into these complex conversations that we really almost couldn't have, given the fact that we were not trained physicists. But we talk about the Big Bang. So nothing would be here if it wasn't, so when the Big Bang took off, there were matter and antimatter particles. There was 1 in a trillion more matter particles than antimatter particles, or nothing would be here today. That's how close the idea of whether or not we would have been here. If the Earth was 5% closer to the sun or 10% further away, it couldn't have supported life. I mean, when you talk about, if your ancestor hadn't successfully bred for the last, 25 generations, you wouldn't be here. I mean, the privilege of having your seat, much less being an alcoholic, most of whom never get any help, never get diagnosed, never get close to the answer, and you're sitting in a seat where you not only have been exposed to the answer, but you've been involved enough in your own recovery that you're willing to spend a couple $100 to have this seat, to have the conversation that people are so eloquently conversing about. For the first 350 million years, there were no atoms. It was just a plasma. It was all energy. And as Howard said, we don't know what the hell energy is. We can use it, we can describe it, but we really don't know what it is. And Howard, and I wish Steve were up here imitating Howard. Steve does a lot of things well, but he does an imitation of Howard that is quite good. And in that, Howard said, that's all there was. There was nothing else. For 350 million years, as the universe expanded, there were no atoms. There were just the smallest of all subatomic particles and some electrons. And he said, if that was all there was, he said, do you think that was God? I mean, where the hell else would God be? I mean, he said, I think that was God. Now, that sounds a little goofy, but what if God was in everything? What if God was everything? If we know just a little bit about atomic physics, subatomic physics, we know that there are 4 essential forces, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, and gravity. Those forces, what if that was the expression of God? What if every cell in our body was an expression of God? What if we are part of the spiritual evolution? So religions make up an anthropomorphic story. Each has their own cultural wisdom that is contained in the boat of, Hindus and Catholics and Islams and, Islamic Muslims. But some of those anthropomorphic models are breaking down, and people no longer have quite sometimes the interest in those religious models as a description of what God is and who God is. Usually a male, there's all sorts of different things that people, have some issues with. And when I'm putting this forth, this isn't just the only thing I believe. I'm a Catholic, and I have some belief systems which are not very important. We don't give a damn in AA what you believe. We really want to know what your experience is. We just don't care what you believe. It's nice. We honor your right to believe and do what you do. But this idea that not only has there been a physical evolution, but there's been a spiritual evolution. I'm 75 years old. There's been a spiritual evolution in my lifetime. I mean, from, what the major religions were in, 1943 when I was born. They were very common. Most people belonged to them. Everybody kind of, we were much more Christian. We had a much more uniform belief. Today, that's very different today. Our societies are much more complex. And I think but this idea to me of a God that is not arbitrary, that is everywhere, in everything. I remember my spiritual advisor who I lost the year I lost Dick Martin, bad year. I lost Dick Martin, I lost my spiritual advisor who I had for 35 years. He was a medical doctor, and he said to me something someone else said to me a long, long time ago. He said, everything you're made of is God. And I wanted to punch him. I mean, it sounded like, something that you just, heretical statement. He said, if I took a cell out of your hand, he said, everything in that cell would be Bob Bazan's. Now, that cell wouldn't be everything Bob Bazan's is. But he gave me this idea that maybe all these statements that people have been making for centuries about religion, that we're made in the image and likeness of God, what if our operating system was God? I mean, there are a lot of unexplained things that I think happen in our recovery. You're sitting in a meeting and someone like Steve or Daryl or whatever the hell your name is, Charlie, says something, and your soul just goes, oh yeah. It doesn't go, oh, I like that, I'm going to write that down. It just knows that you have said something. Yeah, you made a statement that I wrote down. You said, it's been true for me all my life, but I never knew it until I heard this woman or man say it at the meeting. I'm not saying it as eloquently as you did, but it was that. And we have a knower. No one taught us that. We had never heard, so when you hear those magical, wonderful things that these guys and gals come up with, who knows that? What if you couldn't learn anything you don't already know? What if almost everything that we learn of any significance is relearning? That it really has a sense of, of coming home. It has a sense of, I know this at a different level than just having heard it, on Tuesday. I know it as a thing. So, along with my more traditional beliefs, I have been engaging in kind of a more universal idea of the power of my higher power. And it is I like it. It has given me some energy around. I have almost zero interest in dogma and theology, and even though I was brought up and trained with that, went to Catholic university, I just don't have any interest in it. I have interest in what you've taught me to have interest in my experience. So when I participate in my church, I go for the sacraments, and it's about all I want. I want the experience of grounding myself in that situation. It doesn't have, but other than that, my grounding is in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know where in the world anybody would go to have spirituality at the depth and strength that we have it in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, combined with common sense. It is to have it have no theology, to have our founders ground us in the freedom that they had. I mean, it's just the idea that you could pick a Pick your own definition. Start where you are. It's just an extraordinary thing. There are 4 or 5 places in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous that point to spiritual awakening. So the first one that I'm going to talk about, what was the gentleman's name who read? John. So he read the spiritual appendix. Thank you. And that's the one that we're most familiar with, that spiritual appendix. The personality change sufficient to bring about sobriety. But can you imagine that Bill is going through DTs in Towns Hospital in December 11th or 12th of 1934. And he has his spiritual hot flash. And he calls Silkworth into the room. And the medical doctor, he says, this is what happened to me. This is my experience. What do you think? And Silkworth says, hang on to it, baby. You didn't have anything a few minutes ago. Hang on to this. There's something different. Now, can you imagine the humility of that doctor? I mean, how many people, I just find that so extraordinary that a medical doctor, who so easily could have written it off to delirium tremens, supported his experience that he had. And, so he said, so when he talked about how hopeless it is for most people who have alcoholism, that, they see almost no recoveries. They just, see relapse after relapse after relapse. And then he said something, this is repeated over and over, talking about the experiment of the first drink, until you can experience an entire psychic change. There is very little hope of recovery. Then he says, so whenever they talk about spirituality can happen over time, or it can happen at the snap of a finger. It's both. On the other hand, as strange as it may seem to those who don't understand, once a psychic change has occurred, the very same person who seemed doomed, who seemed to have so many problems, he despaired of ever solving them, suddenly finds himself easily, in Towns Hospital. Suddenly finds himself easily able to control his desire for alcohol, the only effort necessary being that he follow a few simple rules. So an entire psychic change where all of it, and on the preceding page, he says, in nearly all cases, their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. Now, this language is pretty darn spiritual for a medical doctor in 1934 working in a drunk ward. There are 2 other places. Well, I'm going to go to Young next, I guess. So Roland goes over to Young, spends the better part of a year with Young. Young pats him on the head, blesses him, and he goes back to Paris, and when he's in Paris, he gets drunk, and he's just flabbergasted. He literally can't believe that he, after getting all the insight that he got from Jung, he comes back and he throws himself at Jung thing. He said, what the hell do I do? And Jung said, look, I've been trying to help you. I thought I could do something for you, but he said, you're a chronic alcoholic. I've never, one of the 3 fathers of psychoanalysis, Freud, Adler, and Jung, I have never been successful with an alcoholic of your description. He said, get a bodyguard, find someone to take care of you. Now he's from a wealthy family in Rhode Island. They're, a million people. I mean, and of course, he's also a drunk, so he says, isn't there an exception? So Jung says, yeah. He said, there is an exception to the cases such as yours have been occurring since early time, here and there, once in a while. Alcoholics have what we call vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. ideas, emotions, and attitudes that were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. Again, another guy. I listen to books on tape. I'm walking up and down this hill that I walk in Mexico in the winter. And I'm listening to Modern Man in Search of His Soul, which is, so Bill Wilson sent that book to Bob early on in his recovery. Hey, Smitty, read this, great stuff. And I'm listening to that book on tape, and Jung says, I have never had a patient whose problem could not be solved by a significant conscious contact with the God of his understanding. Jung, pretty extraordinary. So now on page 50, there's two more places in the book that I'm going to briefly talk about. In the chapter, Do We Agnostics, towards the bottom of the page, they're describing, since they have come to believe in a power greater than themselves, to take a certain attitude towards the power, to do certain simple things, there's been a revolutionary change in the way of living and thinking. And the last one that I'm going to read is 143. Another surprising guy, Hank Parkhurst. So tomorrow when we read the chapter to the wives, Bill wrote it. But Hank was the only guy that wrote a chapter outside of, Bill. Interesting relationship those two men had. And Hank is talking to, I think, the banker. I should have read more about this, but he says, it should be understood that he must undergo a change of heart, which is part of the language I've always loved about it. To get over drinking will require a transformation of thought and attitude. And he has to place his recovery above everything else. But here's Hank, the business guy, sober like Bill, a couple of years, talking about that it requires a transformation of thought. I just think that is extraordinary. If you were to tell any of your friends, that aren't related to the program, that, you were going to bring someone someplace and with the expectation that they were going to have a spiritual awakening, that wouldn't translate very well. They just wouldn't, be able to think you were going to be on the corner with your tambourine and, they would not, that would be not something that they could easily do. But we, without any real training, so when we just happen to have a meeting and it's a discussion on the 11th step and you've got 50 people in the room, everybody can go around the room and almost everybody has something personal and significant to talk about their experience with a spiritual awakening. There's no other room in the world. I don't care. It's our language, so I guess it might be logical at one level that we could have that conversation in Alcoholics Anonymous. But I don't know if there's another room that you could go into and have people identify that change. The transformation is not just a change. It's not just an improvement. It's not just a new idea. It is, and it's not something you can make happen. It's something that happens to you. It's a gift. It is not, this is not mechanical. This is not if I go through and I dot the I's and I cross the T's, that I'm guaranteed that I'm going to have a spiritual awakening. That may sound argumentative because we're here talking about the steps in the program and everybody gets the same thing. So let's go to Bill Wilson for a moment and talk about his spiritual awakening. So do people know who Mel Barger is? Mel Barger was a guy who died with about 65-ish years of sobriety. He's a Cleveland guy. He was an author. Pardon me? Yeah. Okay. Quiet down. Mike, you have any medication? You can kind of give it. That'd be good. So Barger is kind of like Paul Martin. He wrote a lot of articles for the Grapevine. He kind of, he was one of the guys that was going to rewrite AA Comes of Age, but we never got around to being able to accept the people who did the work on that, and then he worked on Pass It On. So Barger's sober a year and a half, and he goes to Cleveland. He listens to Bill. Bill wrote, so Barger's two big questions. He writes Bill a letter, and his two big questions is he thinks that the 12 and 12 is less positive than the big book, and he wants to know why. And then he wants to know why. He wants to know about Bill's mountaintop experience. And Bill writes him back a letter, a newcomer, 3.5-page letter. And towards the end of the second page, Bill talks about his hot flash. When the doors of perception are open widely enough by ego deflation. So when we talk about what's the opening for us, what's the gift? The gift isn't the hot flash. The gift is the collapse of the ego. Without the collapse of the ego, we're not going to have the spiritual experience. There isn't an entry point. It's like an egg. We are not receptive. When the doors of perception are open widely enough by ego deflation, we get these glimpses of the ultimate destiny. Nor are these experiences confined by any means to adherents of Christian religions. Even a little reading in the field of comparative religion would let us know this. The next page, he says, I quit Congregational Sunday School at 11 because they asked me to sign a temperance pledge. So, he said, so neither he nor Bob was when I went through Bob's library with Sue, I was trying to buy it and have it put in the intergroup at Akron. Sue eventually sold that library to Brown University, but we were trying to get it either in the guest house or... So he says, I don't think imperative that neither my theological views nor those of Dr. Bob ever had any appreciable influence on AA. That would only create another competing religion. Of these, we certainly have enough. On further point with me, the original experience was so prodigious, the preview of destiny so intense, that I have never had any difficulty with the doubts since that time. Even at my worst, and it's been often damn bad, the sense of presence of God has never deserted me, has pulled me through some awful jams. My doubts have been more about myself as an ongoing concern. Never has there been a question about the ultimate destiny of us all or God's justice and love. Long ago, I became a pupil of AA around me. People were doing much better with themselves in a spiritual sense than I ever could. Founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. In my role as Mr. AA, I've been enabled to manage fairly well. But as one neurotic drunk trying to get along and grow, I've often been pathetically rebellious and rationalized. Practically all the sins I didn't have time for when drinking, I've since fallen for, at least in the last 12 years of life. To a newcomer. Despite all my blessings and opportunity, I spent 8 years of depression, some of them sometimes very severe ones. However, there's been a profit for AA. Even in my state of affairs, the depressions kept me off the road. Bill, for about 20 years, only spoke at Founders Day for Bob. He stopped talking on the road. The depressions have kept me off the road from making speeches. In fact, I was forced to sit home and ask what would become of AA, what would become of me. The result was the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous and the present world service structure. So maybe I grew up a little. Also, at any rate, let's hope. Dr. Bob was made of better stuff. In his personal life, he always came closer to spiritual achievement than I ever did. He seemed never to have been victimized by awful conflicts, though this is not for sure because he was a real stoic. Unlike me, he was a vast reader of spiritual and psychic literature. He had a great library of it. By contrast, my own reading has been very sparse. I've rather relied more on observation and conversation. I guess I'm still a shopper at the pie counter, at the theological pie counter. Still wondering, in many respects, what it's all about. So, my friend, you will now have the latest bulletin on my own state of grace. I do hope that this helps reduce any overestimate you may have had about me. we talk about him being a salesman, and his ego is so big. This man had a real humility, I believe. And then he says, I do hope for another thing, the real impossible, that someday the society will let me just be a plain member. Devotedly yours, Bill Wilson. The other definition of a spiritual awakening is in the 12 and 12, and I'll read that now. Bill says, when a man or woman has a spiritual awakening, the most important meaning is that it now has become able to do and feel and believe that which they could not do before on their unaided strength and resources alone. He has been granted a gift which amounts to a new state of consciousness and being. He's been set on a path which tells him he's really going someplace. And then the bottom of the paragraph, he says, what he's received is a free gift, and yet usually, in some sense, in a small part, he's made himself ready to receive it. I thought that was a wonderful statement of what our recovery is, that it's a gift, but in some significant way, we make ourselves ready to receive it. I like that thing. AA's manner of making ready to receive the gift is the practice of the 12 steps in our program. So let's consider, then he goes on and talks about the 12 steps. The design of the program, the order of the steps, so as a practical matter, when we talk about, the other thing you sometimes hear at a meeting is, I wonder if I have had any spiritual experience. And I kind of came up with my own sort of thing. I think some of the people who presented here could probably do better, but I always liked too when Bill talked about when he got sober. He never said I got sober on the December 11th, 1934. He says I experienced my release. And Lois used the same language. I experienced my release on December 11th, 1934. So on page 64, one of Charlie's favorite, those 3 or 4 pages right after step 3, it says first once we get the spiritual malady in order, we get well emotionally and physically. And I always thought that was backwards. I always thought, I said we get well, I was young, we get well physically first, we get well emotionally second, and we get well spiritually third. That's the most complex, sophisticated aspect, that's later, okay? I no longer believe that. I believe that Bill was correct, and I believe he put his finger right on it. What we are dealing with people, we are people who are family and friends and doctors and employers have been trying to get us help for a very long period of time, and we would have none of it. We are name, rank, and serial number. We're impossible to have a conversation with about getting help, okay? And all of a sudden, this person is going to meetings, reading the book, getting a sponsor. What the hell has happened? Without even the person realizing that it's happened. It's the same thing in treatment. They open the trunk door and throw Bill out of the thing, and he goes in and he's in treatment. He spent the first 2 weeks he's planning how to kill his wife if he ever gets out. They're trying to hold him in treatment. And then about 3 weeks in, boom, something happens to Bill. And all of a sudden he's in the game. Everybody knows he's in the game. Now, Bill doesn't think anything is different in the 3rd week than it was before, but all of a sudden he's the guy stopping the people from leaving. What's happened? Step 1, the surrender. His ego has collapsed, and all of a sudden he's doing things that is a spiritual awakening. This is not an improvement. This is not a change. He's not even thinking this through. He wasn't given a set of instructions about exactly what to do, maybe somewhat with a sponsor, but there's a power going through this man or woman. Secondly, when we start through the steps, I don't know if it'd be interesting later on if you agree with me or not, Charlie, but why are resentments so damn corrosive to us? And one of the reasons is I think there's lots of reasons for it. But the other is if you have a resentment, you're blaming other people. I mean, you are not taking responsibility for your life. And the essence of what happens in step 4 is owning your life. It is, and that is a lazy Susan. That's a 180-degree turn. I think we all feel subtly like we were victims of circumstances and bad breaks. If our life had been a little bit better, if I got treated a little bit better, if this happened in a little different way, got a little bit more money or whatever the hell it was, but we kind of thought of ourselves, and we've been developing a story for the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, our story is the explanation for the unexplainable. You know, we're on that like white on rice. It is, I mean, our story is very important. But all of a sudden, when we start doing the inventory and we get to step 4, and that lazy Susan gets turned around, and we're owning our lives. That's, to me, a spiritual awakening. That change is not explainable in a matter of a few days or a matter of a few weeks. It is too big an event to be explained by information. Too big an event to be explained by words. You know, these changes are beyond words. They are not, you know, because they're of God, you can point to them, but words cannot contain them. My favorite is, you know, when you're working with a new person and you make the mistake of asking them how they are, they do the dump. You know, they talk about the car, the job, the police, the insurance, the money problems, the bad checks, and all the sorts of things. And somewhere about 3 months into the process, without any circumstance changing, you ask him how he is. And he says, "Oh, I'm okay. I was a little nuts on Tuesday, but I'm okay." What the hell changed? Not an iota of difference in the circumstances. But all of a sudden, this man has gone from being at the effect of the circumstances of his life to understanding that his job is to respond to whatever's going on in his life. He's using the program to respond. 2 ways to be happy: get what you want or be okay with whatever happens. And when Steve talked, when you kind of quoted Sandy about the definition of, I always thought that was a cheap shot, that he took away the definition of problems in the process of having the conversation. That all of a sudden, there aren't problems. All of a sudden, our job is simply to be in union, to be connected, to be with whatever is coming down the pipe. Now, once you've made that change, it's Groundhog Day. It doesn't matter what comes down the pipe. All of a sudden, it's like every day is the same. There are days that are more trying than others, but I'm okay, because my job is simply dealing with whatever. I've got a program now. I've got a sponsor. I've got a group. I've got a power greater than myself, and I can deal with whatever comes down the pipe. That's a different grounding. That change is a spiritual awakening. And lastly, and I mean, there are so many more, but the other most powerful one is, how do you go from the second column in your inventory to steps 8 and 9? How does your resentment list end up being your amends list? Now, that isn't true with everybody, but I'll tell you, it's astoundingly true for many of us. And if you told most new people like that, you couldn't get them to do the inventory, because the idea of them going to the people that are on their resentment list and doing it is just anathema to them. They just, they wouldn't buy it, they wouldn't believe it, but they just automatically get led by the power of these spiritual actions. There is a power in these things. They alter us. They're like I shouldn't talk Catholicism, but when I grew up, they taught you that there was things called sacraments, and that when you did a sacrament, there was an added grace. I believe when you do a step, there's a grace in the step. I believe that there's a power in the step. It's implied. It isn't theology. You don't have to believe that, but when you actually start to see your life change as a result of the participating in these spiritual principles, it's really unbelievably important. We are problem people, as Bill Wilson said of us. Most of us do not want a cure. We want relief. Give me my stuff back. We have conditions. I'm like, we really don't want a cure. It's too violent. We're willing to make a little allowance, but it is. We're afraid about what it looks like. We're being asked to turn our lives around. Is a pretty spectacular thing. The other great power to me there's so many powers, but one of the great things in Alcoholics Anonymous, and you quoted Eckhart Tolle when you were talking, is we're not trying to get better. Now, most of us, I think, are, because that's our paradigm. We're taught most of our lives to get better. We're going to do the steps better. We're going to do a better inventory, get a better sponsor, do the different thing. What happens in Alcoholics Anonymous is they're bringing you to the goodness that's already in your lives. They're not bringing you to a goodness that you never have had. They're restoring you, in some cases, to a place you've never been, to what's already there. It's coming home. The process of finding God is the process of removal, not addition. It is, there's nothing to do. It's already done. That is one of the main reasons why it is so accessible to everyone, regardless of 20 years, to be restored to the goodness that has always been there. Unconditional. It isn't, in some ways, the worse we are, the ego, we have a chance to have that ego reduction, that opening, and to have the grace of God come in. And when that happens, it is transforming, not changing, not improving, not becoming someone else. When you had that little baby here, I wish you were here at the moment. If I held up Francesca, 14 days old or 16 days old, you look at it, and as I say, it's like looking at God. And when you look at it, there's a sense of there's something a hell of a lot bigger than what I'm looking at. There's something really profound with what I'm interacting with. Now, what happens between Francesca and Bob, 75 years old? We no longer look at Bob with that potential. Why is Francesca more wonderful than Bob? But therein lies one of the great mysteries of life. We have, Dylan, not big Dylan, little Dylan, at 3.5. Okay. He's already in a problem area. We're already have a... But at 3.5, we have a list of defects of character and behaviors that Dylan better change to be okay, to be approved of. Okay. Now, Francesca doesn't have to do anything. But think about that. What the hell is the difference between Dylan and me, or Francesca and Dylan? That's not an unpowerful question. It is, I think, one of the great questions of life. So what I think the program of Alcoholics Anonymous does is it restores us to who we've always been. And in many cases, we have never been able to demonstrate that heritage. The power of the program is just unbelievable. The people's lives that we're, I was thinking so sadly, my daughter-in-law is on the streets. 2 kids. Math teacher, lovely woman, loves her children, hasn't talked to them in 1.5 years. there's enough sadness in that to go around for a long time. But there is available in an instant, that spark to get their pilot light lit, to go to the hopeless person and, like E.T., those old timers, put their finger, light your pilot light, put cardboard up around you so it doesn't blow out, and you're going to be okay. So, thank you.